Judge Charles Wright was known for his unwavering attention to the letter of the law. His courtroom, situated in the heart of the city, was a place where rules were followed strictly, and leniency was a rare commodity. As a seasoned judge, he had seen all kinds of cases: petty offenses, minor traffic violations, and serious criminal charges. Today, however, the case in front of him seemed rather ordinary, a routine parking violation. Deja Robinson, a 34-year-old single mother, stood in front of him, her eyes a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She explained that she had parked in a handicapped spot because her young son, Malik, was suffering from a sudden asthma attack. Deja had rushed him to the car, hoping to get him to the hospital quickly, but when she arrived, the only available spot was one designated for disabled parking. With no time to search for another space, she had made a quick decision. "I understand it's against the rules," Deja said, her voice calm but firm. "But my son's health was the priority. He couldn't breathe, and I needed to get him medical help immediately." The courtroom fell silent for a moment as Judge Wright studied her. He had seen many excuses for breaking the law, some legitimate, others less so, but this one didn't seem to impress him. His gaze was cool, calculating, as he flipped through the papers in front of him. "You parked in a handicapped spot without the proper permit, Mom," Judge Wright said, his voice steady and unyielding. "Rules are rules, and while I sympathize with your situation, the law is clear." He glanced up at her with a hint of sternness. "I am imposing a fine. This is not the place to make exceptions." Deja's heart sank. She had expected a more empathetic response. It wasn't that she wanted to break the law, but the situation had been urgent. Still, she knew the reality of life. Rules were rarely bent for anyone, no matter the circumstance. She had hoped the judge might show some understanding, but it was clear that was not going to happen. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied quietly, holding her ground despite the rising frustration within her. The judge nodded curtly and moved on to the next case, signaling the end of her hearing. Deja gathered her things and slowly walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the fine pressing down on her already heavy shoulders. As she stepped into the hallway, the bitter taste of injustice lingered. She had done everything she could to care for her son, but the system had once again shown little compassion for her situation. The fine wasn't just a financial burden. It felt like another reminder of how little the law accounted for people like her, juggling the chaos of life with a constant fight for fairness. Deja's steps were slow as she walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the fine still heavy in her chest. She had spent the past year navigating the relentless pressures of being a single mother, and now this fine felt like just another blow in a long series of struggles. The money she would have to pay, money she didn't have, would take away from her son's medical bills, or perhaps her own needs. It was all too familiar, working harder than most, but still always falling short of what was needed. The law, as it seemed to her, was blind to her reality. As she reached her car, Deja pulled out her phone and scrolled through a few messages from her mother, asking if Malik was okay. Deja paused, reading the texts before typing a quick response. "He's fine now, but I've got a court fine to deal with." She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, feeling the sting of helplessness. Once home, with Malik resting in his room, Deja knew she couldn't just let this injustice slide. The more she thought about the judge's dismissive attitude, the angrier she became. The fine wasn't the only thing that stung. It was the way she'd been treated, as if her explanation didn't matter, as if she were just another rule breaker in a long list. But Deja wasn't just anyone. She had worked too hard for too long to accept being brushed aside. As a senior policy advisor for the Department of Labor, Deja was no stranger to advocacy and legal reform. She had spent years crafting and influencing policies, particularly around family leave, to ensure that hardworking individuals, especially women and people of color, had the support they needed when life became overwhelming. The hypocrisy of it all hit her like a wave. She was sitting in an office, crafting laws meant to protect people like herself, Yet her own experience in the courtroom had been the exact opposite. That night, she sat down at her kitchen table, laptop open, her fingers hesitating above the keys. This wasn't just about her fine. This was about a system that seemed to ignore the complexities of life, a system that punished people for things that were often beyond their control. With a deep breath, Deja began typing, pouring her frustrations into a letter to Judge Wright. She was direct but respectful. She wrote about her situation, not just her son's health emergency, but about the ongoing struggles of Black mothers who worked hard, who loved fiercely, and yet often had to navigate systems stacked against them. She shared the importance of family leave, something she knew intimately. She wanted him to understand that real life wasn't as black and white as he might have believed. She finished the letter, reread it, then hit send. The words, once on paper, felt empowering. Maybe the judge wouldn't change his mind, but Deja had done something more important. She had used her voice. Judge Charles Wright sat at his desk the following morning, flipping through his inbox as he sipped his coffee. The stack of paperwork was overwhelming, but there was one letter that stood out, tucked between the usual flood of case files. It was from Deja Robinson, the woman he had fined the day before. He was prepared to quickly skim it, no different from the hundreds of letters he received over the years, usually complaints or requests for leniency. What he didn't expect was the depth of the message. As he read her letter, he was struck by the tone, which was both respectful and firm. Deja hadn't just written to complain about her fine. She had poured her heart into explaining the real-life implications of her situation, the complexities of being a mother balancing a sick child and a high-pressure job. But it wasn't just about her personal struggle. Deja had opened up about her work, her role in shaping federal family leave policies. Judge Wright paused, the words on the screen lingering in his mind. He hadn't anticipated this. He knew Deja's fine was trivial in comparison to the larger scope of the issues she worked on, but he had no idea she was involved in drafting federal laws. He wasn't just facing a routine case of someone with an excuse for breaking the law. He was reading about someone shaping the laws that affected millions of families. The realization hit him hard. He couldn't ignore the weight of her words now. Deja wasn't just a woman pleading for understanding. She was an active participant in a conversation that had the potential to change the lives of people in similar situations. The thought that he, someone tasked with interpreting and enforcing laws, hadn't fully understood the consequences of his decisions started to gnaw at him. As he scrolled further, Deja spoke of how crucial family leave was to people like her, those who faced health challenges, those who had to take care of their children or elderly relatives while trying to maintain their livelihoods. She explained that systems like the one that fined her were often stacked against those who needed help the most. The fine for parking in a handicapped space, she pointed out, wasn't just a financial burden. It represented a small but significant part of a larger issue, how policies fail to take into account the real needs of everyday people. Judge Wright set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He felt an unfamiliar sense of discomfort. Was he part of the problem? He had been so focused on upholding the law that he had failed to truly understand the human side of it. Deja's letter wasn't just an explanation. It was a wake-up call. For the first time, he wondered if the law, in its rigid form, sometimes missed the mark. And now, more than ever, he was curious to know more about the woman who had just opened his eyes. Judge Charles Wright sat back in his leather chair, staring out the window of his office, the letter from Deja Robinson still sitting on his desk. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room, but his mind was far from the calm surroundings. He kept replaying the words Deja had written, particularly the parts about her work with federal family leave laws. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, he was seeing beyond the black and white world of courtroom procedures into a reality he had never fully considered. He had prided himself on being impartial and fair, but now he wondered, had he really been fair? He thought about Deja's situation, her desperate rush to care for her son, and how, in his courtroom, It had seemed insignificant compared to the rule he was bound to enforce. Was it truly just a matter of following the letter of the law, or was there more to consider? What if the system he had helped uphold wasn't as just as he had always believed? Judge Wright shook his head, as if trying to clear his thoughts. He had been a judge for over 20 years. His decisions were based on the facts, the law, and the expectations set before him. But Deeja's letter had cracked that foundation. It wasn't just her fine that bothered him. It was the realization that she wasn't alone. There were countless others like her, struggling to balance work, family, and health while the system continued to overlook their needs. He thought back to his own experiences as a young man, growing up in a privileged neighborhood, surrounded by resources and support. His family had never faced the kind of challenges Deeja described in her letter. Challenges that seemed to come with being a working-class mother of color in a system that didn't always take her needs into account. His whole life had been a series of advantages, and in that moment, he began to see just how little he understood the lives of people like Deeja. Judge Wright stood up from his desk, walking slowly around the room. His eyes fell on the photos of his children. 2 grown sons, both of whom had always had everything they needed. They had never been faced with the kind of decisions Deeja had to make on a daily basis. The thought of his own family needing help, of one of his children being sick and not having the right support, made him pause. Could it be that Deeja's situation was not so different from any parent's? The idea felt revolutionary, unsettling even. Wasn't the law supposed to be a tool for justice, for fairness? How had it come to this? A place where even the most well-intentioned rulings could fail to reflect the complex realities of people's lives. He sat back down at his desk, pulling the letter closer again. He knew, in that moment, that something needed to change, not just in the way he viewed the law, but in the way he interacted with it. The following week, Judge Wright found himself staring at Deeja's letter once again. It had stayed with him longer than he anticipated. He had reread it several times, each time coming to the same conclusion. Something needed to change. There was more to justice than simply following the rules. He had been living in a world of black and white legalities for too long. What about the gray areas? What about the real-life complexities of the people who walked through his courtroom? For the first time in his career, Judge Wright felt the need to reach out to someone. Not for a case, not for professional purposes, but to have a real conversation about something important. He wanted to understand Deeja's world, her perspective, and how the system could be more than just an enforcer of rules. It could also be a vehicle for fairness, compassion, and change. He spent the next few days drafting an email, wrestling with how to phrase his thoughts. He wasn't sure if Deeja would even respond. After all, he had fined her in court just days earlier. And now he was asking for a conversation. Would she even want to engage with him after the way he had treated her? He hesitated, but finally, with a deep breath, he sent the message. The next morning, he received a response. Judge Wright. The email began, "I appreciate your outreach, and I would be happy to meet with you. While I was initially skeptical about your intentions, I believe that this conversation could be meaningful. Let me know when you are available." Relief flooded through him as he read her words. He was both excited and nervous. What could she teach him about the real-life consequences of the laws he enforced? Could a single conversation help him understand what had been missing from his perspective? They arranged to meet at a local cafe, a neutral public space where they could talk without the formality of a courtroom or office. The day of the meeting, Judge Wright arrived early, feeling slightly out of place in his suit and tie, surrounded by the casual chatter of people enjoying their coffee. When Deeja walked in, she was everything he had imagined. Confident, calm, but with an undeniable strength that radiated from her. Judge Wright, she greeted him, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you for taking the time to meet. Thank you for agreeing to sit down with me," he replied. "I'm sure you have a lot of things to do, so I'll keep this as brief as I can." Deeja nodded, settling into her seat. "I'm glad you reached out. I didn't expect it, but I think it's important to have these conversations. Sometimes change starts with a small shift in perspective. The words hit him harder than he expected. A small shift in perspective. That's exactly what he was hoping for. He had reached out because he needed to see beyond the surface, beyond the black and white. "I've been reflecting on your letter," Judge Wright began, "and I realize I've been too narrow in my thinking. I want to understand what's really going on behind the cases I see in my courtroom. Can you help me understand your work? What's it really like to fight for changes in family leave laws?" Deja smiled, a mix of guarded optimism and cautious hope. This was just the beginning. Deja took a slow sip of her coffee, collecting her thoughts before answering Judge Wright's question. She had agreed to meet with him because she recognized that change often starts with a willingness to listen. But as she looked at the judge across the table, she wasn't entirely sure what to expect. After all, just a few days ago, she had been sitting in his courtroom, trying to explain her side of the story, only to be met with a cold fine and an even colder dismissal. But now, here he was, asking to understand her work. She wondered if he was sincere. "Well, Judge," Deja began, choosing her words carefully, "fighting for family leave laws isn't just about policies on paper. It's about real families, like mine, like the people you see in your courtroom every day. The policies we work on, they don't always make headlines, but they impact the lives of millions of people. People who have to make decisions like whether to leave their job to care for a sick child or risk losing everything to take care of their health or a family member." She paused, watching his reaction. There was no defensiveness in his posture, no resistance in his eyes. In fact, there was something new, a quiet openness. She pressed on. "Family leave laws are meant to be a safety net, but if you're a single mother or a woman of color in a low-wage job, that safety net can feel more like a hammock, a place you can rest, but not somewhere you can stay long enough to heal. The system isn't built for people like me. It wasn't built for people who have to juggle the needs of their families, their jobs, and their own well-being at the same time." Judge Wright nodded slowly, listening intently. For the first time, Deja felt like her words were not just falling on deaf ears. He was absorbing what she was saying, perhaps even processing it with a depth she hadn't expected. "I didn't understand it like that before," Judge Wright admitted, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. "I've always thought of family leave laws as something simple, just a policy issue. But hearing you talk about the real consequences, the personal stakes for people who are already balancing so much, it's eye-opening." Deja leaned forward slightly, encouraged by his response. It's easy to dismiss something when you've never had to fight for it. When you have the resources, the backup, the support, it doesn't feel as urgent. But for so many, it's the difference between surviving and thriving, or sometimes just getting by. The conversation continued, but now it wasn't just an exchange of information. It was an exchange of perspectives, a shift in understanding. Judge Wright began to ask questions, real questions, about the families Deja worked for, the obstacles they faced, and how the law could truly serve them. The more they talked, the more Deja realized that she was reaching someone who hadn't just heard her, but was beginning to see the world through her eyes. For the first time in a long while, Deja felt hope creeping in. This wasn't just a meeting between a judge and a policy advisor. It was a moment where both of them were seeing the world differently. And that, she thought, was how real change began. As the conversation continued, Deja and Judge Wright found themselves speaking more freely, moving past the formalities of their roles. Deja shared stories of families who faced impossible choices, mothers who had to decide between their jobs and caring for their children, fathers who were forced to forego medical treatment because they couldn't afford to miss work. She told him about the endless battles she had witnessed, where people pushed themselves to the brink just to hold everything together. Judge Wright listened carefully, his mind swirling with a mix of thoughts. He had always prided himself on upholding the law, but now he was beginning to understand that law could sometimes be too rigid, too distant from the human experience. He realized how often his decisions in the courtroom didn't take into account the struggles that everyday people faced. He had thought he was dispensing justice, but now he wondered how often his rulings fell short of true fairness. "I never realized how much the system fails people who are already at a disadvantage," Judge Wright said quietly. "I've been focused on the rules, on what the law says, but it's the people, their lives, that I've overlooked." Deja nodded, sensing the sincerity in his words. "That's the problem. The law is meant to serve people, not the other way around. When we forget about the human side of things, we're just enforcing rules for the sake of rules. It doesn't work, not when it comes to people's lives." Judge Wright took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed that the law was a clear-cut path to fairness. But now he saw that fairness wasn't just about following a set of rules. It was about understanding the circumstances behind those who were caught in the system. It was about the people who had no choice but to break the rules to protect their families, their health, or their future. As the conversation wound down, Judge Wright felt a shift within himself. This wasn't just about changing the way he viewed family leave or parking violations. This was about rethinking his entire approach to justice. It was about recognizing that the law was not an isolated entity. It was part of a larger fabric of society, a fabric woven from the lives of the people it impacted. "I've been too quick to judge," Judge Wright admitted, the words feeling like an unburdening. "I see that now. I've made rulings without considering the full picture, and I'm sorry for that." Deja smiled, a small but genuine smile. "We all make mistakes, but the important part is what we do next. Understanding is the first step. Change takes time, but it starts with the willingness to listen." As they parted ways, there was an unspoken understanding between them. It wasn't just a conversation, it had been a turning point. Judge Wright had gained a deeper understanding of the world beyond his courtroom. And Deja, for the first time, saw a glimpse of the kind of change that was possible when people in power opened their hearts to the stories of those they served. In the weeks that followed, Judge Wright began to approach his work with a new sense of awareness. He couldn't erase the past. He couldn't undo the fines, the rulings that may have unintentionally hurt people like Deja. But he could change the way he looked at the cases before him. Every time someone walked into his courtroom, he made a conscious effort to see more than just the offense they were charged with. He began to ask questions that mattered beyond the paperwork. What was the context of their actions? What were their personal circumstances? How could the law serve them, not just punish them? Deja's letter had opened his eyes to the human side of justice, and he was determined to honor that new understanding in his daily work. One of his first opportunities to apply this shift in perspective came when a woman walked into his courtroom for a parking violation. As the case was being called, Judge Wright noticed that she seemed anxious, almost frantic. Her hands were shaking as she presented her explanation. She had parked illegally because her young daughter had fallen ill while they were out running errands. The woman had rushed her child to the hospital, but had been cited for parking in a restricted area. For a moment, Judge Wright hesitated. He remembered Deja's words about balancing family responsibilities with the harsh realities of the system. The woman wasn't just a rule breaker. She was a mother caught in an emergency. Without missing a beat, Judge Wright called a brief recess. When the woman returned to the bench, he dismissed the charge, telling her, "I understand that life doesn't always go according to plan. In this case, you were acting out of necessity, not disregard for the law. You're free to go." The woman's eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, Judge Wright didn't feel like he was merely enforcing rules. He felt like he was doing something more important: listening, understanding, and acting with compassion. After that day, he found himself making similar decisions with more frequency. Cases that once would have been swiftly closed with a fine were now met with more thoughtful consideration. He wasn't just ruling on what was in front of him. He was thinking about how his decisions affected the people involved. One afternoon, Deja received a letter from Judge Wright. He thanked her for the letter she had sent, for opening his eyes to a larger picture. He also invited her to speak at a legal seminar about her work in family leave policy and the importance of compassionate justice. It was a small but significant gesture, an acknowledgement of the shift in his perspective, one that was still unfolding but already making an impact. Dija smiled as she read the letter, feeling a sense of pride that her words had sparked something meaningful. She had always known that change started with a single conversation. Today, she realized the conversation had begun to ripple out, touching others in ways she hadn't imagined. For both of them, this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but now, it was a road they were ready to walk together, toward a more compassionate and just future.